Anishinaabe, also known as the Northwoods or the Northern Great Lakes area, has been targeted for mining since the settler society came over to this continent, Turtle Island, from the 1800s when treaties were made to open up certain areas for iron ore and copper mining, to the 1900s when iron ore operations continued, iron ore mining operations on into the present day, where the call for electric vehicles and increased wind projects and solar farms are increasing the demand for things like copper and nickel for batteries, for electrical components. And so the Northwoods is once again being slated and targeted for opening up new mines in Anishinaabeg. So let's take a look at some of that history here in Anishinaabeg. We're going to take a look briefly at the 1800s history, when the mining first was brought here to the settler society by the settler society, and then we'll move on into taking a look at a significant struggle against multinational mining companies in northern Wisconsin in the late 1900s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and we'll move on and take a brief look at some of the things that are happening in the Northwoods throughout Anishinaabe in terms of the mining industry today. First off, the Anishinaabe are a people who are a forest culture. The Anishinaabe, every aspect of culture is really centered or derived from, comes from being people who live in a forested area, and particularly in the Northwoods. There's a really interesting concept, I think, that comes out of Anishinaabe language that illustrates this deep connection and caring respect for the land, and that's a term called kinomage, which is an Ojibwe term or Anishinaabe term. Ojibwe is one of the Anishinaabe three fires. It's an Anishinaabe term which roughly translates as education. It's the learning people do, the teaching that people get as they're being educated. But if you look at it more closely, you find that kinomage actually literally translates as the earth shows us the way. So right embedded in Anishinaabe culture is the idea that we learn from the earth. The earth is our teacher. And with that, when we say the earth, that's all our relatives, all beings. They are our teachers, right? So this is a clear indication to me of how much the Anishinaabe culture cares for and respects the land on which the Anishinaabe live. Another example of the Anishinaabe and their connection to the Northwoods and to the land is a general thing. There's a book called Night Flying Woman, written by an Ojibwe woman named Ignatia Broker, and in it, she tells the story of one of her grandmothers from the 1800s at the time that the treaty era was coming in and Anishinaabe people were being forced off of their homelands and onto reservations. As this process is happening, her grandmother is told, or starts telling people, the younger generation, with so much change having happened over a couple of decades, that one way to remember who you are as an Anishinaabe person is to listen to the sisagwad, the sound that the wind makes through the trees. And in the book, specifically, she mentions the sound that the wind makes through the pines. And of course, Anishinaabe or the Northwoods is nothing if it's not big pine country, right? Not that there's big pines everywhere, but big pines are what really help identify this country, this land. In fact, Anishinaabe activist Walt Brissett once talked about how we have not yet taken the time to mourn our pines, referring to the big cut era that came after the treaties were signed as well in the late 1800s, and the slaughter of the forest in Anishinaabe or the Northern Great Lakes area that occurred after that, to the point that today we have less than 1% of our original pre-colonial forests here in what is now called Michigan, and it's roughly equivalent in Wisconsin as well. And I am not sure what the numbers are in Minnesota, but my suspicions are they're about the same, because each of these, what are now called states, experienced this big cut. And of course, if you imagine for the Anishinaabe, what did this mean, this loss of the forest that your entire culture and sense of being, sense of identity is based on? We don't have many records of that. The only ones we have are of people saying, yes, there were these massive fires after the huge logging operations, and we know that there were some Anishinaabe living in those areas that were burned over, and that's all that they know. There's not much record that's kept out there, so that's a big gap in our history here, in our recorded history. The Anishinaabe, of course, have not always lived in the Northwoods in the Northern Great Lakes area. There was a time where they spent many generations out on the east coast of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. But about, people estimate, somewhere between 500 to 1,000 or so years ago, there were these prophets who came to the Anishinaabe who were living on the east coast, and they said, if you continue to remain here, there's going to be some great trials, and you're really going to go through some really bad times. And we've had this vision, this one prophet said, we've had this vision that we need to move westward to where the food grows on water. And following this person's vision, many of the Anishinaabe, not all, but many of the Anishinaabe started on this long migration that people think took several centuries to return back to the Great Lakes area. And I say return because there are also people who suggest that the Anishinaabe had lived in the northern Great Lakes area, had lived here several millennia ago. Big question mark as to when that would be. But anyway, there are people who say this is a return migration for the Anishinaabe. And they stopped at various places, different groups having different ideas of where exactly was supposed to be the final stopping point for the people. And so you have different places like Manitoulin Island, Bawatin, or what's also called Sault Ste. Marie today, and then the island of the golden-breasted woodpecker, which is located on the Apostle Islands, what people call many people call Madeline Island today. And there are some who say that some of the Anishinaabe even continued on their migration far west out to the Rocky Mountains and the Great Plains area, some speculating that the Cheyenne may actually be a part of the Anishinaabe. So a very interesting history and story here. So the Anishinaabe returned to the Great Lakes area some 500 to 1,000 years ago, and they have lived here and came from, the East Coast over what is now known as Maine and that area. Very similar sort of landscape, so the traditional ecological knowledge they carried with them would have translated well over to the northern Great Lakes area. The northern Great Lakes area, of course, had its own unique ecology, including the food that grows on water, the goodberry monomen or wild rice, and that was, all part of the prophecies that the Anishinaabe were following. Come the 1500s, we have the French coming in. And they, by and large, had a really great relationship with the Anishinaabe. With the French, we later also have the British coming in. The British did not have such a great relationship with the Anishinaabe, but both brought in, as well as the Americans eventually, the fur trade to the northern Great Lakes area. And that started to change and shift things. But still, especially with the French for the Anishinaabe, lifestyles remained fairly similar to what they had been before, though, like I said, there were significant changes that were happening with corporations moving in and exploiting the fur-bearing relatives up here in the northern Great Lakes area. So there were significant changes, but the land as a whole had not been dramatically altered, as was about to happen in the treaty era. So the Americans, particularly as the fur trade, the bottom dropped out of the fur trade market, and it became less and less profitable for the Americans and others to be making money from this sort of economy. That's when the Americans started to take a look at Anishinaabe King and say, we've heard of this gigantic copper boulder that exists up there. We've heard that there's these metals. And so they eventually, sent up in 1820 what was known as the Cass Expedition to explore this area, specifically for the so-called natural resources that people could profit from if the Anishinaabe were situated such that they gave up or relinquished the title to this land, right? So that was the 1820 Cass Expedition led by first governor of Michigan, Lewis Cass, and they made these different treaties. 1836 was known as the Timber Treaty. It was to gain access to the forests of the Anishinaabe in the the eastern Upper Peninsula and the northwestern part of the Lower Peninsula. There was the Treaty of 1842, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as Treaty of 1854, which had similar intents of 1842 and 1837. So these are some of the key treaties that in which the Anishinaabe signed their land over to the United States government, what we call ceded, C-E-D-E-D, ceded their land to the U.S. government. In other words, it was a land cession. They were agreeing through this series of treaties that the United States government was going to take over this land. Now, many people argue that the Anishinaabe, when they signed these treaties, weren't realizing they were relinquishing, rights to their land, that many felt it was just the Americans wanting to come in and they were willing to share the land with the Americans. But the Americans had a very different conception of what these treaties were about. I also want to mention the Menominee, who are part of this territory. In fact, they've been here. Their archaeological evidence and their oral history indicates they've been here for 10,000 years, since the last ice age, since the last glaciers moved out. So they have been an integral part of the Northwoods for a long time. And in fact, their name refers to the wild rice, right? So the Anishinaabe coming in would have been in frequent contact with the Menominee, and there seems to have been friendly relations between the Anishinaabe and the Menominee. The opening of the mineral district, that's what the Treaty of 1842 was all about, wanting to get at the copper and iron ore in the western Upper Peninsula. In particular, the treaty also included about the northern third of northern Wisconsin, the northern third of Wisconsin there. And so this ushered in an era of mining for the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And these are pictures here of the three mining pictures are relatively recent. The very bottom right one is from 1960s, I believe. And then the top right one is from present day. That is the tailings pile outside of the Palmer, town of Palmer, which is just south of Negaunee and Ishpeming. And it is a tailings pile from an iron ore mine that often rivals Mount Arvon for being the tallest point in the state of Michigan. And the open pit mine that this tailing is coming from is what the scenery is behind all of this. And I also, even though we're not going to focus on it in this lecture, I have a small picture of the logging era, a picture to represent the logging era in Anishinaabeg when these massive, beautiful, giant, particularly white pines were taken from the forest. But these were ancient forests, and there are we talk about old trees that can live really old, and we have hemlocks that can live to be over 800 years old, and cedars that live over 1,000, and oaks and maples that can live, several hundred years old. But there are also forests. Forests as an organism, as an entity, are so connected together. They are like one organism. And we do still have some of those, very few places left, like the Sylvania wilderness area is a forest that they estimate is several thousand years old, right? So it was a forest that was not touched by this logging. So we can still go to those places. Hartwick Pines is a forest that was protected by a logging company's the head of a logging company. His wife protected this place called Hartwick Pines because these beautiful pines that had started growing after a forest fire in the 1600s, she wanted to protect them so people would know, what kind of forest was here. So you can still go see those gorgeous and amazing pines and get an idea of what the pre-colonial forest would have been like. But the big cut took care of like I said, 99% of our forests in Michigan and Wisconsin. Along with the treaties of the 1800s wanting to open up the mineral district and that desire to do mining in Anishinaabe leading to the removal of Anishinaabe people and sequestering them on reservations, that happened in the 1800s. By the turn of the 20th century, end of the 1800s into the early half of the 1900s, we had people, Americans, university experts, from places like Stevens Point or, downstate in Lansing. So we had University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point was P.S. Lovejoy, I believe. Or no, it was George Werwin. And down at Michigan State University was P.S. Lovejoy. Or it could be flipped just the other way around. But the point what I want to say here is that we had these social engineers who were looking at Anishinaabe, particularly northern Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And they saw what had happened after the big cut, like this picture you have here. They saw that mining was going on and was, had been doing pretty well. But then they also saw that there were a number of people who were living self-sufficiently up here, whether these were subsistence farmers who were settlers who had come in, or they were native people who were making a living off of the land. These people were not doing business with the American economy. They were living from the land and being self-sufficient as families and as communities. And this is what these social engineers, they took a look at that and says, this has to change. They decided that people's life, they needed to pass policies and zoning regulations to shape Anishinaabe, to shape the Northwoods, northern Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, to shape the Northwoods so that it would be such that people would not be able to make a self-sufficient living from the land. That was their goal, to make people what they called productive participants in the nation's industrial economy. So they deliberately set out to undermine self-sufficiency from the land in Anishinaabe Akin. So I wanted to take a look a little bit at some of these attitudes that were behind this, because what I wanted to talk about here is in Anishinaabe Akin is we're facing mining threats. It's not just threats to the Anishinaabe people and to their way of life. It's threats to the people of the land of every, cultural heritage that live up here. Because when you love the land and are part of the land, if something threatens the land, it threatens you and who you are as a person and what your heritage is and what your culture is, right? So this is something we all share in common, and we keep having these things come up that keep us divided and from recognizing this, but we all share this experience in common. And it's also taking a look at how attitudes are about people who are in power, people who come from urban universities, and take a look at rural peoples and people of the land, and they say, these people aren't doing what we think they should be doing, therefore we are going to create conditions in such a way that they will be forced to adapt and to change and become involved in activities that we think are better suited for our national economy. And this is all part and parcel of the way colonization works. So let's take a look. Social engineers Lovejoy and George Werwin looked at the population of northern Wisconsin and Michigan's Upper Peninsula and said these people are a result of what they called eugenic carelessness. And this is a direct quote. And at this time, in the early 20th century, there was a eugenics movement going on that honestly felt there were people who had defective genes and that poverty was a genetic, that poverty was genetic. You inherited the gene for poverty or something. And so when people who were poor were having kids, they took a look at this and said, this is wrong. What these people are doing up here, they are bringing down the human gene pool. So we really got to figure out what we want to do about these people who are having so many kids, or not even having so many, just having kids as a direct result of what they saw of careless breeding, essentially, is to put it in really crass terms. That's what they were seeing. That's how they were viewing those of us who lived up here in the Northwoods. In fact, interestingly enough, Alda Leopold was evidently very good friends with P.S. Lovejoy, so much so that when Lovejoy died, Alda Leopold was asked to write Lovejoy's obituary. And in Lovejoy's obituary, Alda Leopold wrote praising Lovejoy, saying he really appreciated his ideas and that sort of thing. And one of the things he brings out is that Lovejoy said the ultimate question is not how to step up human carrying capacities per habitat, but what sort of humans we want to have around at all. And I bring this point out because around the time of the 20th century, the environmental movement or conservation movement really started to take off. And as we'll see here, it had very elitist tendencies. And one of these tendencies was to take a look at people who were poor, people who were living self-sufficiently from the land through hunting and fishing and farming, and look down on them as genetically defective, as people who were undesirables in the national economy. So even as these environmentalists like Alda Leopold and Lovejoy were trying to put in conservation measures to protect the land, they were looking down on the people who lived on the land. So yeah, we have Alda Leopold praising Lovejoy's concept of carrying capacities, which of course carrying capacity is the idea of how many beings can a particular land support. But Lovejoy, praised by Leopold, took that further and said not just what kind of beings, but what kind of human beings can this habitat support, and what kind of human beings do we even want to have around at all? And from that answer to that question, going on to make policies that decide what kind of human beings can live on this land at all. I hope you're seeing the horrors in this, and the elitism, and the arrogance that is being applied in this situation, right? It's a combination of racism, classism, and perhaps a word we haven't even coined yet. Maybe we could call it urbanism, the looking down on people who live from the land, who are self-sufficient in living from the land, whether they're native or non-native. Lovejoy and Werwin looked at us up here and they said it's only breeding paupers and morons and fires. This land is only breeding paupers, morons, and fires. Fires comes from the big cut era and the legacy was left over. You know, we have this huge slashed landscape. There were a lot of fires that happened as a result of that. Morons is an actual technical term from the eugenics movement, which identified people as not being considered as smart as others and therefore not deserving of being able to have children. So these people were forcibly sterilized. And paupers, pauperism, being poor, was also seen by the eugenic movement. That was another term that the eugenics movements used to refer to people they saw as genetically inferior because they were poor. And many of these people too were forcibly sterilized. And on the topic of forced sterilization, some people may have heard of the forced sterilization policies that were directed towards Native people, towards African American women, towards women who were Hispanic women. And these sterilization procedures, involuntary sterilization procedures, happened well up into the 1970s, 1980s, even some people have talked about it. And that's a whole issue in and of itself that I suggest you look into. I don't want to get distracted from my main point here. But the idea is this also happened to people who were considered kind of backcountry folks who were poor. Down south, they would have referred to them as hillbillies. And so these social work departments were making the decision that they did not deserve to have children. So you would have, like down south, there was people who would go in regularly every couple years, round up all the 11 and 12-year-olds, take them into the county hospital, ostensibly to do different health tests on them, like for tuberculosis, or have their tonsils removed. And when they came back, they didn't know it until years later when these children, grown up now, couldn't have kids. And some of them went to the doctor, and the doctor would say to the woman, well, your tubes were tied, didn't you know that? And they found out that it was actually the county health departments that was doing that to these kids because they were considered poor and from the backwoods and therefore genetically inferior. Same thing happened to Native women as well, even up into the 1970s. And like I said, some people have even talked about in the 1980s where they go in to have a child, they get, maybe anesthetized to have that child. And not knowing in the millions of papers that you sign when you enter the hospital that one of those papers they signed was that they agreed to sterilization. So many Native women left those hospitals having given birth to their last child without knowing that they were had given birth to their last child, right? So really scary stuff based on racism, classism, and like I said, what you might term urbanism, the discrimination against people who are people of the land. Lovejoy and Werwin felt that it was very important to get rid of what they called troublemakers in the back 40s, people who lived in the far backwoods. Many of these tended to be, Native people or mixed blood people, or the Finnish they'd come over, work in the mines, and get out as fast as they could and get back into the woods. So Lovejoy and Werwin worked with county boards to develop zoning policies where people would be discouraged from through taxation or requirements that their children attend school and on a regular basis, or any other number of factors that were used to coerce people to leave the backwoods and come live closer to towns where they would then be less self-sufficient, the idea was, and become dependent on the nation's industrial economy and thus become productive members of this industrial economy. Crazy stuff, but all happening right up here. In fact, the whole goal of these social engineers, like I keep mentioning, is the suppression of subsistence living, meaning to make these people who lived in the Anishinaabe, native or non-native, productive contributors to the national economy. The conservation measures that were put in place, such as the forerunners of what we know of as the Department of Natural Resources today, or conservation leagues like the Isaac Walton League, they were based on the idea that there was sports hunting and there was, the other kind of hunting. And sportsmen were to be looked up to. It was almost this idea that it was a way of one, proving one's manhood by going out and hunting, but two, being the top predator, that man, literally man, should be the top predator in any system and therefore have complete control of these animals who are out there by being the top predator. But people who made a living by providing for their families and communities with hunting were looked down on as that wasn't a good way to be. That was a low-class kind of thing to do. So these conservation measures with hunting and fishing were put in place where you actually had to purchase licenses in order to go out hunting and fishing, and only the people who had money could do that. The people who were making a living just from the land and really weren't dealing much in money, they didn't have the money to purchase those licenses. This included Native and non-Native people alike. So there was a real bias towards encouraging sport hunting and a real bias towards discouraging people who were hunting and fishing to provide for their families. And to get directly back to the Native point of this, for the Anishinaabe people, their treaty rights were ignored as these state game laws were developed. When the Anishinaabe signed those treaties of 1842, 1854, 1836, and even 1837, I believe, when they said, we are agreeing to this land cession, we want to guarantee in these documents that we and our descendants will have the right to hunt, fish, and gather on these lands, because this is how we make a living. This is how we survive. This is who we are, by hunting, fishing, and gathering. And so the Anishinaabe literally reserved the right to hunt, fish, and gather on all of the ceded territory, all the land that they were signing over to the United States. And so this meant being able to hunt, fish, and gather off the reservation. But by 1900, state game law agencies, like I said, the forerunners to the Department of Natural Resources, are now starting to arrest Anishinaabe people for literally exercising their treaty rights and ignoring those treaty rights that the Anishinaabe had made as a sovereign, Anishinaabe sovereign nations with the sovereign nation of the United States, which the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota had less status because those treaties were made between sovereign nations, and the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan were not sovereign nations, so they had less status. Yet those states were pushing those treaty rights aside and arresting people for exercising those treaty rights. And this continues for several decades.